Maya Chen wiped down table 7 for the third time that evening, her mind wandering to a place far from the clinking of wine glasses and the buzz of dinner conversation. Her feet ached in the black non-slip shoes she'd bought from the discount store, and a strand of hair had escaped from her tight ponytail, tickling her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear with practiced efficiency, the same way she did everything these days, quick, automatic, without thinking. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she'd walked across that stage in her cap and gown, diploma in hand, ready to conquer the world as a concert pianist. 5 years since her professors had called her exceptional and destined for greatness. 5 years since she believed them. Now, at 28, she carried plates of pasta and poured wine at Russo's Italian restaurant in downtown Seattle. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 18 years of her life training her hands to create beauty, and now those same hands smelled like marinara sauce and dish soap. But that wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part sat in the corner of the restaurant, gleaming under a soft spotlight. A Steinway grand piano, its black surface polished to perfection, its keys ivory and pristine. It called to her every single shift, a silent reminder of everything she'd worked for and everything she'd lost. Well, not lost exactly, just postponed, indefinitely postponed. Maya grabbed the coffee pot and made her rounds, forcing a smile that had become second nature. Table 3 needed refills. Table 5 wanted the check. Table 8 had a question about the dessert menu. She moved through the motions smoothly, her body present while her mind drifted to the Chopin nocturne she used to play, her fingers unconsciously pressing imaginary keys against the handle of the coffee pot. "You okay there, Maya?" Her co-worker Danny bumped her shoulder gently as they passed in the narrow hallway to the kitchen. "You've got that faraway look again." She snapped back to reality. "Yeah, just tired." Danny nodded knowingly. He was studying engineering, working nights to pay tuition. Everyone at Russo's had a story like that. Dreams on hold, bills that couldn't wait, reality that didn't care about your passion or your degree or the fact that you'd once been told you were special. Mr. Russo, the owner, emerged from his office as the dinner rush began to slow. He was a stocky man in his 60s with kind eyes and a thick Italian accent that customers found charming. He'd been good to Maya, giving her extra shifts when she needed them, never complaining when she showed up with sheet music tucked in her bag that she'd study during breaks. He knew her story. Everyone did. She'd told him during the interview, trying to explain the gap in her resume, the absence of relevant restaurant experience. She'd been performing, she'd said. Small recitals, a few competitions, teaching piano lessons on the side. But the teaching barely covered rent and the performances, well, they paid in exposure and experience, two things that landlords didn't accept as currency. The student loans had started coming due, $60,000 worth of education, of private lessons, of master classes and recitals and countless hours in practice rooms, money borrowed with the confidence of someone who believed talent was enough, someone who thought the world was waiting for her music. She'd been naive. The classical music world was brutal. For every position, there were hundreds of qualified applicants. Everyone was talented. Everyone was exceptional. Everyone had devoted their lives to their instrument. Being good wasn't enough. Being great wasn't even enough. You needed connections, luck, money to float you through the unpaid apprenticeships and low-paying teaching gigs until you maybe, possibly, if you were one of the chosen few, got your break. Maya couldn't afford to wait for maybe, so she tucked her dreams into a corner of her heart, put on a black button-up shirt and an apron, and learned how to carry 3 plates at once. The piano in the corner mocked her every shift. Mr. Russo had bought it years ago, thinking it would add ambiance to the restaurant. On weekends, he hired an older gentleman named Frank to play during dinner service. Frank was nice enough, competent enough. He played standards and crowd favorites, background music that people barely noticed. Safe, pleasant, forgettable. Maya tried not to feel bitter about it. Frank needed the work too. And besides, Mr. Russo had never offered her the position. Why would he? She was a waitress. The piano player job was different, separate, reserved for Frank and occasionally one of his substitutes. She'd never asked if she could play. Pride maybe, or fear. Fear that Mr. Russo would say no or worse, say yes and then be disappointed. Fear that she'd sit down at that beautiful instrument and discover she'd forgotten how, that her fingers had lost their magic somewhere between the Beethoven and the breadsticks. At night, in her tiny studio apartment, she'd practice on the digital keyboard she'd bought used for $200. It wasn't the same. The keys were too light, too plastic. There was no resonance, no soul. But it was all she could afford, and it kept her fingers moving, kept the muscle memory alive. She told herself it was temporary. Just until she paid down the loans a bit, just until she saved enough for a cushion, just until some miracle that would let her return to the world she'd been training for since she was 6 years. Old but temporary had a way of becoming permanent. When you weren't looking, as Maya cleared dishes from table 12, she noticed a couple seated near the piano. They were dressed elegantly, celebrating something special judging by the champagne and the way they kept holding hands across the table. The woman kept glancing at the piano with a wistful expression. "Excuse me," the woman called softly as Maya passed. "Does anyone play that beautiful piano?" "We have a pianist on weekends," Maya replied with her professional smile. "Friday and Saturday nights. Oh, that's too bad. Today's our anniversary and we met at a piano bar." The woman squeezed her husband's hand. It would have been perfect. Maya felt something twist in her chest. She opened her mouth, almost saying she could play, almost offering. But she caught herself. It wasn't her place. This was her job, and her job was serving food, not performing. "Congratulations on your anniversary," she said instead, and moved on. But the moment stayed with her, nagging at something deep inside. The look on that woman's face. The silent piano. Her own hands, capable of creating something beautiful, instead just carrying plates. Later, as she counted her tips in the break room, Mr. Russo's voice drifted through the doorway. He was on the phone, his tone stressed. She caught fragments. Friday night. Fully booked. The anniversary party. Can't cancel now. Her curiosity got the better of her. She poked her head out. Mr. Russo had hung up and was rubbing his temples, looking more worried than she'd ever seen him. "Everything okay, Mr. Russo?" He looked up, startled. "Oh, Maya, yes, no, I don't know," he sighed heavily. "Frank just called. He's sick, can't play this Friday. And we have that big private party, the 50th anniversary celebration. I promised them live piano music. They specifically requested it." Maya's heart started beating faster. This was it. The moment. The opening, but fear held her tongue. What if she wasn't good enough anymore? What if she embarrassed herself? What if she embarrassed Mr. Russo in front of his important clients? "I'm sure you'll figure something out," she heard herself say, the words tasting like cowardice. She went home that night hating herself just a little bit more, wondering when exactly she'd become someone who let opportunities slip away, someone who played it safe, someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to take a chance on her own talent. The digital keyboard in her apartment seemed to stare at her accusingly. She sat down and began to play, her fingers finding their way through a piece she'd once performed in competition. The music filled her small space, and for those few minutes she wasn't a waitress. She was a pianist. She was an artist. She was the person she'd trained her whole life to become. And that made Monday morning, when she'd put the apron back on, so much harder to bear. Friday arrived faster than Maya expected, and with it came a knot of anxiety in her stomach that had nothing to do with her. She'd spent the last few days thinking about that piano, about Mr. Russo's stressed face, about the opportunity she'd let slip through her fingers without even trying. She arrived for her shift at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the dinner service began. The restaurant was quiet, just the kitchen staff prepping for the evening rush. The smell of fresh bread and simmering tomato sauce filled the air. Normally, these hours were peaceful, a calm before the storm. But today, tension hung in the atmosphere like humidity before a thunderstorm. Mr. Russo was in the dining room, personally checking every table setting for the anniversary party. 50 years of marriage. The couple had rented out half the restaurant, invited 30 of their closest friends and family. It was the kind of event that could lead to more bookings, more private parties, more business. The kind of event where everything needed to be perfect, and there was no pianist. Maya tied her apron, watching Mr. Russo move from table to table, adjusting a fork here, a napkin there. He looked exhausted. She'd heard through Danny that he'd spent the last 2 days calling every pianist he could find. Too short notice. Already booked. Out of town. No one available. Maya, His voice made her jump. She hadn't realized he'd spotted her. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what was coming. She'd been preparing for this moment, rehearsing what she'd say, how she'd respond. But now that it was here, every practiced word vanished from her mind. They stood beside the piano. Up close, it was even more beautiful than she'd allowed herself to notice. The wood grain was rich and deep. She could see her reflection in the polished surface. "I know this is unusual," Mr. Russo began, his hands fidgeting with his wedding ring. "And I know it's not your job. But I'm desperate here, Maya. I've got 30 people arriving in 3 hours expecting live piano music, and I've got nothing." He paused, looking at her directly. "You studied piano, right? At that fancy music school?" "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Would you be willing to play tonight? Just background music, nothing fancy, just something to fill the silence." He rushed on before she could respond. "I'll pay you extra, of course. Double your hourly rate, and you won't have to do any table service. Just play, please." Maya stared at the piano keys, 88 black and white rectangles that had once been her entire world. Her fingers tingled with the memory of countless scales, arpeggios, sonatas, years of practice compressed into this single moment. "Just simple background music?" she asked. "That's all? Easy stuff. Whatever you know. The guests will be talking, eating. They just want some ambiance." Mr. Russo's desperation was palpable. "You'd be saving my life here, Maya." She thought about saying no, thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea. She was out of practice. She'd mess up. She'd embarrass herself. The safe thing, the smart thing, was to decline. But then she thought about going home tonight, lying in bed, regretting this moment for the rest of her life. "Okay," she heard herself say. "I'll do it." The relief on Mr. Russo's face was immediate and profound. "Thank you. Thank you so much, Maya. You're a lifesaver." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of panic and preparation. Maya sat at the piano during the quiet pre-service time, her hands shaking as she tested the keys. The sound was incredible, rich, full, resonant. Nothing like her plastic keyboard at home. This was a real instrument, one that responded to every subtle variation in her touch. She ran through scales, warming up fingers that felt stiff with nervousness. She tried a few pieces, keeping them simple. A basic jazz standard. A gentle classical arrangement. Nothing too complicated. Nothing that would expose her if she messed up. Danny poked his head out from the kitchen. "That's beautiful, Maya. I didn't know you could play like that." "I'm pretty rusty," she said, immediately downplaying it. Safer that way. By 6 o'clock, the guests started arriving. Maya watched from the piano bench as they filed in, all dressed elegantly. The anniversary couple was easy to spot. The woman in a lovely blue dress, the man in a crisp suit, both of them glowing with happiness. 50 years together. Maya tried to imagine that kind of commitment, that kind of love. Mr. Russo gave her a small nod. It was time. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes came out more hesitant than she'd intended. She chose a simple melody, something from the standard piano bar repertoire. Safe, unobtrusive, the kind of music that blends into the background of conversation and clinking glasses. As she played, she kept her eyes mostly on the keys, occasionally glancing up at the guests. They were talking, laughing, not paying attention to her. Which was fine. That was the job. Background music, ambient noise with a melody. But something inside her ached. Her fingers knew more than this. They'd been trained for more than this. Every simple chord progression felt like a cage, like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. She knew exactly what she was doing, playing it safe, staying in the shallow end, not making waves. She transitioned into another piece, then another. Gentle jazz standards that everyone had heard 1,000 times. Pleasant melodies that required maybe 20% of her actual ability. It was fine. It was professional. It was exactly what Mr. Russo had asked for, and it was killing her. The guests ate their appetizers. Wine flowed freely. Conversation rose and fell like waves. Maya played on, her fingers moving automatically through progressions she could execute in her sleep. A part of her brain was engaged with the music, but most of her was somewhere else, thinking about the pieces she could be playing, the music she was capable of creating. She watched the anniversary couple at the center table, They kept leaning toward each other, sharing private jokes, their hands intertwined. The woman would occasionally look around at all their loved ones with such joy, such gratitude. This was their night, their celebration, and Maya was providing the soundtrack to their happiness with music that felt hollow. During a natural break between songs, she reached for the water glass Mr. Russo had thoughtfully placed on the piano. Her hands were sweating despite the restaurant's air conditioning. This was ridiculous. She'd performed in front of judges, in competitions, in recitals with hundreds of people watching. Why was playing background music at a restaurant making her this nervous? Because it mattered. That was why. Because she'd forgotten how much she missed this. Missed performing. Missed creating something beautiful. Even if no one was really listening, even if she was playing the simplest possible arrangements, her hands were on a real piano again. She was making music again, and that realization made the restraint even harder to bear. She started another song, keeping it simple, keeping it safe. A server passed by with a tray of pasta, the steam rising with the scent of garlic and basil. Normal restaurant sounds continued around her. Forks on plates, low conversations, laughter from table 6. Maya played on, note after careful note, keeping herself contained, keeping herself small, playing not to fail rather than playing to soar. The main course was served. More wine poured. Someone made a toast to the happy couple, and everyone raised their glasses. Through it all, Maya's fingers moved across the keys, creating a pleasant, forgettable soundtrack. She told herself this was enough. This was what she'd agreed to. This was the job, but deep in her chest something stirred, something that remembered what it felt like to really play, to pour everything into the music, to let the piano become an extension of her soul rather than just background noise for other people's conversations. Not yet, though. Not now. She was doing what was asked, playing it safe, being professional. The feeling, however, wouldn't quite go away. It sat there, patient and persistent, waiting for its moment. And that moment, though Maya didn't know it yet, was coming soon. Dessert service began just after 8 o'clock. Maya had been playing for nearly 2 hours straight, and her shoulders were starting to ache from the tension she carried. Not physical tension from playing. The music itself was easy enough. But emotional tension, the constant effort of holding herself back, of keeping the music contained and controlled. She transitioned into another gentle piece, something light and airy that wouldn't interfere with the dessert course. Tiramisu and cannoli were being served, along with espresso and after-dinner drinks. The mood in the room was warm and jovial. The anniversary couple looked blissfully happy, surrounded by decades of love and friendship. Maya allowed herself a small smile. At least she was contributing to their special evening, even if it was from the shadows. Then she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. An older gentleman was standing from the center table, excusing himself from his companions. He was tall and thin, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and an elegant posture. He walked with the careful dignity of someone who'd once moved with more ease but refused to let age diminish him entirely. He was walking toward the piano. Maya's fingers stumbled over a note, just barely, but she caught it. She recovered quickly, keeping the melody flowing, but her heart rate picked up. Was something wrong? Did he have a request? A complaint? The gentleman reached the piano and stood there quietly, waiting for her to finish the phrase. She brought the song to a gentle conclusion and looked up at him, trying to read his expression. "That was very nice," he said. His voice was cultured, soft but clear. "You play with good technique." "Thank you," Maya replied, unsure where this was going, "but you're holding back." He said it kindly, without judgment, but the observation landed like a stone in her chest. "I can hear it. You're playing the notes, but you're not playing the music." Maya felt her face flush. "I'm just doing background music." "That's what I know," he interrupted gently. "I understand, but I'm curious about something." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "What did you study? Where did you train?" She hesitated. "Pacific Northwest Conservatory. Classical piano." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, that's a fine school. Competitive program." He paused. "So why are you here playing cocktail jazz when you've been trained for much more?" The question hit harder than Maya expected. She felt a sudden burning behind her eyes and blinked rapidly. "Life," she said simply. Bills, loans, the usual reasons. The gentleman nodded slowly as if he understood more than she'd said. My name is Edward Hartley. I taught music theory and composition for 40 years. Retired now, but I still know talent when I hear it. And I can also recognize when someone is hiding their talent. Maya didn't know what to say. She glanced toward the kitchen, wondering if Mr. Russo needed her to keep playing, if this conversation was taking too long. I have a question for you, Edward continued. Do you know any Rachmaninoff? The name hit her like an electric shock. Rachmaninoff. Of course she knew Rachmaninoff. His Piano Concerto No. 2 had been her senior recital piece, the performance that had defined her final year at conservatory. She'd spent 6 months learning it, practicing until her hands cramped and her back ached. It was one of the most technically demanding and emotionally powerful pieces in the classical repertoire. She hadn't played it in 5 years. I know some Rachmaninoff, she managed. The second concerto? Her throat tightened. That was my senior recital piece. Edward's face broke into a warm smile. Perfect. Would you play some of it for us? Just the opening. The first few minutes, Maya's mind raced. The opening of Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto was iconic. Those haunting, melancholic chords that descended like tears, followed by the sweeping, romantic melody. It was powerful, emotional, dramatic, everything she'd been avoiding all evening. I don't know if that's appropriate, she said quickly. This is supposed to be background music. Rachmaninoff is... It's not background music. No, Edward agreed. It's not. It's art. And I think these people deserve to hear some real art tonight. He glanced back at the anniversary couple, 50 years of marriage. That's not a casual achievement. That's an epic love story. It deserves an epic soundtrack, don't you think? Maya looked past him at the guests. They were finishing their desserts, chatting happily. Would they even want to hear classical music? Would Mr. Russo be upset that she was deviating from the safe, simple background arrangements? I'm really rusty, she said, and heard the fear in her own voice. I haven't performed that piece in years. I might mess up. Edward leaned against the piano, his expression gentle but encouraging. Let me tell you something I learned in my 40 years of teaching. Perfection is overrated. What matters is truth, honesty. When a musician stops trying to be perfect and starts trying to communicate something real, that's when magic happens. He straightened up. You've been playing perfectly all evening. Not a single wrong note. But you haven't said anything. You haven't communicated anything. You've been hiding. The words struck deep because they were absolutely true. She had been hiding. Playing it safe. Giving them technical proficiency without vulnerability. Notes without soul. What if I fail? She whispered. Then you fail, Edward said simply. But at least you'll have tried. At least you'll have been honest. He started to walk back to his table, then paused. You know what the real tragedy is? Not failure. The tragedy is having a gift and being too afraid to share it. He returned to his seat, leaving Maya alone at the piano, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked down at the keys. 88 possibilities. A lifetime of training in her muscle memory. Years of dreams compressed into this single moment. Mr. Russo was standing near the kitchen, watching her with a slightly confused expression. She caught his eye and he gave her a questioning look. Was everything okay? Maya made a decision. She took a deep breath, placed her hands in position and nodded to Mr. Russo. She was going to do this. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the practice rooms at conservatory, remembering her teacher's voice guiding her through the emotional landscape of the piece, remembering what it felt like to play not just with her hands but with her entire heart. When she opened her eyes, something had shifted inside her. The fear was still there, but it was smaller now, overshadowed by something stronger. The need to create, the need to express, the need to be honest, she began. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the restaurant. Deep, resonant, achingly beautiful. The notes descended like a prayer, each chord weighted with emotion. This wasn't background music. This was a declaration. The transformation was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Heads turned toward the piano. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Maya didn't notice. She was somewhere else now, lost in the music. Her fingers moved with a fluidity and confidence that had been absent all evening. This was who she really was. This was what she'd trained for. This was the music she'd been born to play. The melody emerged from the chords, soaring and romantic. Her right hand sang the heartbreaking tune while her left hand provided the rich harmonic foundation. The piano responded to every nuance of her touch, every subtle dynamic shift. It was like having a conversation with an old friend, the instrument understanding exactly what she wanted to say. She poured everything into it. 5 years of frustration, 5 years of dreams deferred, 5 years of pretending that serving tables was enough, that she didn't miss this, that she'd made peace with letting go of her passion. All of it flowed through her fingers into the keys, transformed into Rachmaninoff's gorgeous, bittersweet music. The technical demands of the piece didn't intimidate her. Her hands knew what to do. The octave runs, the intricate fingerwork, the powerful fortissimo sections, her body remembered. Muscle memory forged through thousands of hours of practice took over, leaving her mind free to focus on the emotion, the story, the truth of the music. She reached the climax of the opening section, her fingers flying across the keys, the music swelling to fill every corner of the restaurant. And then gradually, she brought it back down, softer, gentler, until the final notes hung in the air like morning mist. Silence. Complete. Absolute silence. Maya opened her eyes, suddenly aware of where she was, what she'd just done. Had she made a terrible mistake? Had she been too loud, too dramatic, too much? Then she heard it, applause. The applause started with Edward, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate claps. Then the anniversary couple joined in, and suddenly the entire restaurant erupted. 30 people rising to their feet, clapping, some of them with tears streaming down their faces. Maya sat frozen at the piano bench, her hands still hovering above the keys. She couldn't process what was happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. She'd been hired to fade into the background, to be pleasant and forgettable. Instead, she'd just poured her entire soul out in front of a room full of strangers. The anniversary woman was openly crying, her husband's arm around her shoulders. Several other guests were wiping their eyes. Even the servers had stopped what they were doing, standing along the walls with stunned expressions. Danny stood in the kitchen doorway with his mouth hanging open. Mr. Russo looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He just stood there, staring at Maya as if seeing her for the first time. The applause went on and on. Maya felt her own eyes fill with tears. She hadn't cried in years, had trained herself not to feel too much, not to want too much. But now all those held-back emotions came flooding out. She'd forgotten what this felt like, to share something real, to be vulnerable, to let people see who she really was. When the applause finally died down, Edward approached the piano again, but this time he wasn't alone. The anniversary couple came with him, along with several other guests. They surrounded the piano, all talking at once, voices overlapping with praise and questions. "That was extraordinary," the anniversary woman said, clutching Maya's hand. "We've been to concerts at Benaroya Hall. We've heard professionals. You belong on a stage, not in a restaurant." Her husband nodded vigorously. "I've never heard anything like that. The emotion, the power. Where do you perform? We'd love to come see you." Maya didn't know how to answer. She didn't perform anywhere. She served pasta and poured wine and went home to practice on a cheap keyboard in a studio apartment that barely fit her bed. "She's wasted here," Edward said, his voice cutting through the chatter. He looked at Maya with such intensity that everyone else fell quiet. "I need to tell you something. I wasn't completely honest earlier. I didn't just teach music. I was on the faculty at Pacific Northwest Conservatory for 20 years. And I'm currently on the board of directors for the Seattle Symphony." Maya's breath caught. The Seattle Symphony, one of the most prestigious orchestras in the region. "We've been developing a community outreach program," Edward continued. "We want to bring classical music to neighborhoods that don't normally have access. Schools, community centers, small venues. We need soloists who can not only play at a high level, but who can connect with audiences emotionally. People who remember why they fell in love with music in the first place." He pulled a business card from his wallet. "I want you to audition for the program. We pay our musicians. Not a fortune, but enough to live on. And it's real performing work. The kind of work you trained for." Maya took the card with shaking hands. Edward Hartley, Board of Directors, Seattle Symphony, a phone number, an email address, a door opening to a world she thought she'd lost forever. "I don't understand," she whispered. Why me? You heard me play for 6 minutes. You don't know anything about me. Edward smiled gently. I know enough. I know you have technical skill. I could hear that in your background music even when you were holding back. But more importantly, I know you have something you can't teach. You have heart. You play like someone who needs music to survive. That's rare. That's valuable. That's what we're looking for. Mr. Russo pushed his way through the small crowd, his eyes still wide with shock. Maya, I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me you could play like that? You didn't ask, Maya said, then immediately felt guilty. I'm sorry. I didn't mean— No, you're right, Mr. Russo shook his head. I saw a waitress. I didn't see a musician. That's my fault. He looked around at the guests, all of whom were still watching Maya with something like awe. Then he looked back at her. Frank is retiring next month. He told me last week. I've been dreading trying to find a replacement. He gestured at the piano. But I don't need to find anyone, do I? The job is yours if you want it. Featured pianist at Russo's. Thursday through Saturday nights. Triple what I pay you for serving. You can still work your other shifts if you need the money, but— He trailed off, seeming to reconsider. Actually, if you take that symphony thing, you probably won't need to wait tables anymore. Maya felt dizzy. Too much was happening too fast. 5 years of nothing, and now everything was changing in a single evening. A woman in an elegant green dress stepped forward. I don't mean to pile on, but I have to say something. I organize the Cascade Music Festival. We showcase emerging artists every summer. I'd love to have you perform. We don't pay as much as the symphony, but it's good exposure, and we get reviewed by all the major papers. She handed Maya another card. Please think about it. Another guest, a man in his 50s, approached next. My daughter is getting married next June. We've been looking for ceremony musicians. Would you be interested? We pay very well for the right performer. More cards, more offers, more possibilities. Maya's head spun trying to take it all in. An hour ago, she'd been invisible. Now she had business cards in both hands and people waiting to talk to her. The evening wound down eventually. The guests left, still buzzing about the performance. The anniversary couple hugged Maya before they departed, thanking her for making their celebration unforgettable. Edward shook her hand firmly and reminded her to call him. Don't wait, he said. The auditions are next month. I want you there. When the restaurant finally emptied, Maya sat back down at the piano. Mr. Russo had gone to his office. Danny and the other staff were cleaning up. The dining room was quiet again, just her and the instrument that had changed everything. She placed her fingers on the keys and played a soft chord. It resonated through the empty space, beautiful and clear. She'd forgotten this feeling. The feeling of being heard, of mattering, of using her gifts for what they were meant for. Danny appeared beside her, a broom in his hand. So I guess you're not going to be a waitress much longer, huh? Maya laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from deep in her chest. I don't know, maybe we'll see what happens, but she did know. Something fundamental had shifted tonight. She'd remembered who she was, what she was capable of, and more importantly, she'd stopped being afraid of her own talent. 3 months later, Maya sat backstage at a community center in South Seattle, waiting to perform. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back the same way she used to wear it for recitals. Her hands were sweating just like always before a performance, but it was good nervousness now, excited nervousness, the kind that meant she cared. She was part of the symphony's outreach program now, 2 performances a month, plus teaching workshops at local schools. The pay wasn't huge, but combined with her Thursday, Friday, and Saturday gigs at Russo's, she was actually making more than she had as a full-time waitress. And she was making it doing what she loved. She'd paid off a chunk of her student loans. Not all of them. That would take years, but enough to breathe easier. Enough to feel like she was moving forward instead of just treading water. Her studio apartment still had the cheap keyboard, but now it was supplemented by regular access to practice rooms at the conservatory. Edward had arranged it. He'd become a mentor of sorts, checking in on her progress, offering advice, connecting her with other musicians. The wedding booking had turned into 3 more weddings. The festival performance was scheduled for July, and just last week, a music school had offered her a teaching position, 2 days a week, working with advanced students. She still waited tables at Russo's 3 nights a week, but it felt different now. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was a pianist who also worked at a restaurant, not a waitress who used to play piano. The distinction mattered. A stagehand poked his head into the room. 5 minutes, Miss Chen. Maya stood and stretched her fingers, running through the warm-up exercises that had been drilled into her since childhood. Her heart beat fast but steady. She was ready. She thought about that Friday night 3 months ago. The moment she'd decided to stop playing it safe. The moment she'd chosen to be vulnerable, to be honest, to share her real self even though it scared her. One performance, 6 minutes of music. That's all it had taken to remember what she'd almost lost forever. Not just her career, but herself. As she walked toward the stage, she could hear the audience settling in. Families, kids, people who maybe had never been to a classical music performance before. People like her, who worked hard and struggled and dreamed of something more. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the faces watching her. And then she began to play. Not background music this time. Not something safe and forgettable, but music that mattered. Music that told a story. Music that reminded everyone in that room, including herself, that beauty existed, that dreams could survive, that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. Her fingers danced across the keys, and Maya Chen was finally, completely, undeniably home.